Berlin, April 1945. The Reich is collapsing in fire and rubble. Soviet artillery pounds the city from the east. The concussions rattling windows in buildings not yet destroyed. American and British forces advance from the west. In the chaos, the machinery of the Third Reich is fragmenting into 1,000 desperate pieces. Ministries are evacuating. Archives are burning. Officers are fleeing or preparing for surrender. And in the basement of the Reich main security office on Prinz Albrechtstrasse, clerks are destroying personnel files by the thousands, feeding decades of documentation into roaring incinerators. Among those files, one is being handled differently. It belongs to Sturmbannführer Werner Brandt, SS Intelligence, assigned to AMT-6, Foreign Intelligence Operations under Walter Schellenberg. Born 1910 in Leipzig. Doctorate in Slavic Languages from Humboldt University, 1933. Recruited into SD in 1936. Posted to various intelligence stations across Eastern Europe throughout the war, Warsaw, Minsk, Smolensk. His file contains operational reports, personnel assessments, communication logs, and assignment records spanning nearly a decade of service. On April 19, 1945, a clerk working in the personnel archive receives an unusual order. Brandt's file is to be pulled from the general evacuation crates and set aside. The order comes through internal channels, marked with a priority designation, but no signature, no explanation. The clerk complies, placing the thick folder in a separate box labeled only with a reference number that corresponds to nothing in the standard filing system. 3 days later, when Soviet forces storm the building, they find rooms full of ash, scattered documents, and broken filing cabinets. They seize what remains, thousands of fragmentary personnel records, operational summaries, intelligence reports. These materials will form the basis for war crimes investigations, denazification proceedings, and historical research for decades to come. Sturmbannführer Werner Brandt's personnel file is not among them. The file has vanished as completely as if it never existed, and within weeks, Brandt himself will follow. Werner Brandt was not a household name, not even within the SS. He held no public position, gave no speeches, appeared in no propaganda photographs. He was AMT-6, Foreign Intelligence, specializing in Soviet affairs. His work was operational planning, source management, intelligence assessment, technical rather than ideological, bureaucratic rather than dramatic, the kind of work that kept the intelligence apparatus functioning, but left no heroic stories to tell. His assignment history, pieced together decades later from fragmentary cross-references in other documents, shows a pattern of postings to areas where the Wehrmacht was either advancing or retreating. Warsaw in 1939, during the invasion and occupation. Minsk in 1941, as Operation Barbarossa swept east. Smolensk in 1942, as the front line stabilized and then began their slow, grinding reversal. Each time, his role was intelligence collection focused on Soviet military capabilities, partisan networks, Communist Party structures. By 1944, as German forces retreated across Eastern Europe, Brandt was recalled to Berlin. His new assignment, analytical work at SD headquarters, producing assessments of Soviet intelligence capabilities and recommendations for counterintelligence operations. Desk work, the kind of assignment given to officers with specialized knowledge who were no longer needed in the field, whose expertise was more valuable in reports than in operations. A routine personnel evaluation from February 1945, discovered decades later in a fragmentary collection of SD documents, described Brandt as exceptionally knowledgeable regarding Soviet intelligence structures, politically unreliable, operationally valuable despite ideological weaknesses. Politically unreliable. The phrase appears only once in his accessible records, but it suggests something. Questions about commitment, doubts about loyalty, the kind of notation that, in another context, might have led to investigation or reassignment to a punishment battalion on the Eastern Front. Instead, Brandt remained in Berlin, working in intelligence analysis, producing reports that fewer and fewer people read as the Reich's final collapse accelerated until there was nothing left to analyze and nowhere left to send reports. On April 23, 1945, with Soviet forces closing in on central Berlin, Brandt was seen leaving SD headquarters carrying a briefcase and a small suitcase. Multiple witnesses later testified to his departure, though their accounts varied on details. Some said he was in uniform. Others remembered civilian clothes. All agreed he was walking west, away from the Soviet advance, toward areas where American or British forces might arrive first. That was the last confirmed sighting by German witnesses. But Allied records tell a different story, or rather, fragments of several different stories that don't quite align. On April 25, 1945, an American counterintelligence corps unit operating near the Elbe River filed a brief report noting the reception of SS officer claiming to possess intelligence materials regarding Soviet operations. The report gave no name, just a notation that the subject was being transferred to higher authority for evaluation, and that his materials appeared potentially valuable. On April 28th, a British intelligence officer in occupied Germany sent a coded message to London mentioning German intelligence officer, formerly SD-AMT-6, currently providing detailed briefing on Soviet intelligence structures and operational methods. Subject cooperating fully. Recommend continued debriefing and assessment for potential utilization. On May 3, 1945, 3 days after Hitler's suicide and 5 days before Germany's surrender, an American OSS memo discussed former SS intelligence personnel with extensive knowledge of Soviet methods, currently under protection pending determination of intelligence value and security classification. None of these documents mention Brandt by name, but the timing, the descriptions of specialty, the references to Soviet intelligence expertise, all aligned. Someone with his exact background had come into Allied custody in the final days. Someone the Allies considered valuable enough to protect, debrief, and classify rather than prosecute. And then, in official records, in the databases being compiled across occupied Germany, in the list being prepared for war crimes investigations, Werner Brandt ceased to exist. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied authorities compiled extensive lists of SS and SD personnel wanted for war crimes investigations. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted the leadership, but thousands of lower-ranking officers faced denazification proceedings, interrogations, and in many cases, prosecution for specific crimes committed during the occupation. Brandt's name appeared on none of these lists. This absence was not immediately noticed. The chaos of 1945 to 1946 meant that many records were incomplete, many personnel were unaccounted for, many files had been destroyed in the final days or lost in the administrative confusion of occupation. The assumption, when anyone thought about it all, was that Brandt had either died in the final battle for Berlin or escaped like so many others into confusion of displaced persons and refugees flooding across a shattered continent. But as the years passed and databases were compiled, cross-referenced, and systematized, patterns emerged. Officers who had served in AMT-6 alongside Brandt were accounted for, arrested, tried, imprisoned, or cleared through denazification and released. Colleagues from his postings in the East were documented, their fates recorded, their testimonies preserved in tribunal archives. Even junior clerks who had worked in the same offices appeared in Allied records, their names, their assignments, their post-war fates all documented. Brandt did not. In 1948, Soviet authorities conducting their own war crimes investigations requested information from Western allies about former SD personnel who had specialized in anti-Soviet intelligence operations. They were particularly interested in officers who had served in occupied Soviet territories and might have committed crimes against civilians or prisoners of war, or who possessed knowledge of German intelligence methods that might inform Soviet counterintelligence operations. A list of names was submitted through official channels. Brandt's name was on it, flagged as having served in Minsk and Smolensk during the occupation. The American response, delivered through official military government channels, stated, Subject Werner Brandt, former SS Sturmbannführer, no information available. Not in U.S. custody. No record detention or processing through denazification system. The British response was identical in substance. No information regarding Subject Brandt. Not detained by British forces. No record in war crimes investigation files. The Soviets, unsatisfied, pressed further. They had found cross-references to Brandt in captured German documents from occupied Belarus, references to intelligence operations that had led to partisan arrests and executions. They wanted to interview him about his role, about what he knew, about what he had done. The Western responses did not change. No information, not in custody. No records available. In 1952, a West German researcher compiling data on former SD personnel for a historical documentation project noted Brandt's name in several wartime operation reports captured in various archives. He filed a formal request with Allied authorities for access to Brandt's personnel file and any post-war interrogation records that might exist. The response came from the U.S. Army's Berlin Document Center, which maintained a vast repository of captured Nazi records. Personnel file for Werner Brandt not located in archives. File may have been destroyed during final evacuation of SD headquarters or lost during Allied seizure of materials. No interrogation records on file. The researcher noted the response and moved on. Missing files were common. The documentation of the Third Reich's collapse was fragmentary at best, and the chaos of April-May 1945 had resulted in the loss or destruction of countless records. What the researcher didn't know was that his inquiry had triggered an internal review at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. A memo, declassified only in 2021, shows that the agency's Eastern Europe division reviewed the request and determined that materials related to subject Brandt remained classified under operational security protocols established 1947. No release authorized. Inquiries to be deflected with standard missing file response. Operational security protocols. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, protocols that required active coordination between archivists and intelligence officers to maintain a consistent story of absence. Through the 1960s and 1970s, historians researching Nazi intelligence operations occasionally encountered Brandt's name in footnotes and cross-references. He appeared in captured SD organizational charts showing the structure of AMT-6. His name was mentioned in memoirs of other intelligence officers who had served in the same departments. He was listed in wartime communication logs, in operational summaries, in after-action reports from the Eastern Front. But there was never any information about what happened to him after April 1945. The standard reference books on SS personnel listed him as Fate Unknown, presumed killed Berlin 1945. Academic studies of German intelligence mention him only in passing, if at all, as one of many mid-level officers whose post-war fate remained undocumented. The silence was systematic, too complete to be accidental. Files that should have existed didn't. Records that should have preserved his post-war fate were absent from multiple archives across multiple countries. Requests for information were met with identical responses from American, British, and German authorities, a coordination of absence that suggested active management rather than bureaucratic oversight. It was the kind of silence that required coordination across institutional boundaries, maintenance through generations of archivists and security officers, institutional memory passed down through classification systems and access protocols, the kind of silence that protected not just a person, but a decision about that person, a decision that someone, somewhere, had determined needed to remain hidden. Dr. Sarah Brenner was researching Operation Rusty, the Allied program to identify and interrogate German intelligence personnel with knowledge of Soviet operations immediately after World War II. A historian specializing in early Cold War intelligence at Georgetown University, Brenner had spent years working through declassified CIA and military intelligence files, trying to understand how the victors had exploited the losers' knowledge in the emerging conflict with the Soviet Union. In 2022, while reviewing a newly released batch of CIA documents from the early 1950s, part of a regular declassification cycle that released materials after 70 years, she found something unexpected. It was an internal memo discussing the security classification of former Axis intelligence personnel currently or formerly under agency protection or employment. The memo listed several criteria for determining which files should remain classified: current operational value, potential diplomatic complications, protection of sources and methods, sensitivity of recruitment circumstances, standard bureaucratic language for maintaining secrets. But attached to the memo was a list of reference numbers corresponding to specific case files. Most were completely redacted, but one was partially visible, the blackout marker having faded slightly over decades. Case 47 Nightingale. Subject: W. Brandt, former SDAMT-6. Status: employed. Classification: protected. Current location: redacted. Review date: not scheduled. The memo was dated 1953, 8 years after the war ended. Werner Brandt hadn't just survived. He had been employed by the CIA, and his file had been marked for permanent classification, with no scheduled review date, an unusual designation even for sensitive Cold War materials. Brenner requested the full Nightingale file through official Freedom of Information Act channels. The response came months later. Requested materials remain classified under National Security Exemption 50 U.S.C. 3024-I. Access denied. She tried a different approach. If Brandt had been employed by American intelligence, there might be references in other files, budget documents, operational summaries, personnel rosters that mention him indirectly without triggering the same classification protections. She was right. In a 1955 CIA budget document, partially declassified in 2019, she found a line item for analytical support, Soviet intelligence structures that included notation, contract personnel, Eastern Europe specialist, continuation of Nightingale arrangement, annual cost $18,000. In a 1958 memo discussing security protocols for former enemy personnel working with U.S. intelligence, there was a paragraph about subject employed since 1947, extensive knowledge of Soviet intelligence methods and organizational structures, identity protection maintained per original recruitment agreement, clearance level, secret. In a 1962 internal CIA newsletter celebrating the agency's 15th anniversary, there was a brief mention of long-serving contract analysts who provided invaluable insights into adversary capabilities, followed by a list of specialties that included Soviet intelligence organization and methods, Eastern European operations. None of these documents named Brandt explicitly, but the timeline, the specialty, the references to Nightingale, and the continuity of employment all pointed to the same conclusion. Werner Brandt had been working for American intelligence for at least 15 years after the war, possibly longer. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 2024, the British government released a batch of Foreign Office files from the immediate post-war period, part of a routine declassification program that had been delayed by bureaucratic reviews. Among them was a 1946 memo discussing coordination with American services regarding employment of former German intelligence personnel with specialized knowledge of Soviet operations. One paragraph read, Subject: Nightingale, Werner Brandt, former SS Sturmenführer, SDAMT-6, transferred to American custody June 1945 per Inter-Allied Agreement. Subject provided extensive debriefing on Soviet intelligence structures, operational methods, and personnel during May-June 1945 and agreed to continued cooperation. British services concur with American recommendation for protection from prosecution and maintenance of classified status given subjects' potential value and sensitivity of recruitment circumstances. Personnel file removal from captured archives confirmed completed. Recruitment circumstances. Personnel file removal confirmed. The phrases suggested something had happened before the transfer, something that made both his protection and the erasure of his official record necessary. Brenner found the answer in an unlikely place. A Soviet intelligence report obtained by Western services during the Cold War and partially declassified in 2023 discussed German intelligence officers who had provided information to Allied services during the war's final months. One entry mentioned SD officer, Berlin headquarters, codename unconfirmed, suspected contact with Western intelligence services beginning January 1945 or earlier. Subject believed to have provided intelligence regarding SD operations and personnel structure in exchange for post-war protection. File removal from German archives noted during seizure operations, suggesting prearrangement. January 1945. For months before Berlin fell. For months before Brandt disappeared from German records and surfaced in Allied custody. The timeline suggested that Brandt hadn't just cooperated after capture. He had been in contact with Allied intelligence while still serving in SD headquarters, providing information about German operations, possibly about his colleagues, about operational methods, in exchange for a promised protection when the war ended. When American forces received him near the Elbe in late April 1945, they weren't capturing an enemy intelligence officer. They were extracting an asset, someone who had already been providing intelligence, who had already made arrangements, who had already been promised protection in exchange for cooperation. His personnel file hadn't been lost in the chaos of Berlin's fall. It had been removed deliberately on orders coordinated between Allied intelligence and German personnel, still nominally loyal to the Reich, but already working for their own survival. The missing file wasn't an accident of war. It was a first step in protection operation that would last decades, erasing any official record of his existence before Allied intelligence took formal custody. Brenner requested additional files from CIA, MI6, and German Federal Archives. The responses were variations on the same theme. Materials related to Subject Brandt and Nightingale operation remain classified. National security concerns, sensitive sources and methods. No declassification date scheduled. She found one final piece of evidence in a 1971 CIA memo discussing pension arrangements for retired intelligence personnel who had provided long-term service under classified arrangements. The memo mentioned Nightingale, retired 1968 after 23 years service, relocated redacted under standard cover arrangement. Monthly pension authorized per a contractual agreement. Continue standard monitoring protocols for protected personnel residing abroad. 23 years of service. From 1945 to 1968, Werner Brandt had worked for American intelligence for nearly a quarter century after the war ended, analyzing Soviet intelligence structures, providing insights based on his wartime experience and linguistic expertise, living under protected identity in a country that was never named, doing work that was never specified. But crucial questions remained unanswered, sealed behind classification barriers that showed no sign of ever being lifted. What specific intelligence had he provided in early 1945 that warranted his protection? How many of his SD colleagues had he betrayed to secure that protection? What crimes might he have been prosecuted for if not protected? What operations had his post-war work enabled or informed? Where did he live after retirement? When did he die? Under what name? Brenner filed a final request asking for any information about Brandt's death or current status, his final years, any documentation that might exist about the end of the story. The CIA response arrived 3 weeks later. No information available regarding current status of Subject Brandt. All materials related to Nightingale operation remain classified under operational security protocols. No additional information can be released at this time. No information available. As if he had vanished a second time, this time from the very apparatus that had protected and employed him for decades. As if even his death had been classified, his grave unmarked, his final identity protected by the same systems that had erased his original 180 years earlier. The truth about Werner Brandt is no longer completely hidden. It exists in fragmentary declassified documents, in cross-references scattered across multiple archives, in the gaps where records should be but aren't. He was an SS intelligence officer who made contact with Allied services in early 1945, probably earlier. His personnel file was deliberately removed from German archives to erase evidence of his existence before prosecution could begin. He was extracted, protected from war crimes investigations, and employed by American intelligence for over 2 decades. He lived somewhere under protected identity until at least 1971, possibly longer. But the full story remains sealed behind classification barriers that span multiple governments and intelligence agencies. The documents that would answer the essential questions: what intelligence did he provide while still serving the SS? How many of his colleagues did he betray? What crimes might he have been prosecuted for, if not protected? What specific work did he do for American intelligence for 23 years? Where did he live after retirement? When did he die? Under what name? Those documents remain classified in Virginia, in London, possibly in Berlin. In 2024, a retired CIA officer speaking on background to a journalist researching Cold War intelligence operations, said something revealing. The Brandt case represents everything complicated about that period. He was SS. He definitely knew about atrocities, probably participated in operations that targeted civilians. That led to deaths. But he also had knowledge we needed desperately in 1945 when we suddenly realized our Soviet allies were going to be our next enemy. Someone made a decision that what he knew was worth more than what he'd done. And then that decision had to be protected, justified, maintained for decades. His file was pulled from German archives before the Soviets could get it, which means we were already planning to use him, already committed protecting him. Declassifying a full file now would mean admitting that calculation explicitly, putting it in a historical record, and institutions don't like doing that. Brenner's research revealed something beyond Brandt's individual story. In the partially declassified documents, she found references to similar case files with similar code names. Nightingale, Sparrow, Falcon, Eagle, Raven. Each was described as a protected asset, former Axis intelligence, specialized knowledge Soviet operations, personnel file removed from German archives. Each file remained classified. Each subject's identity remained protected by the same barriers. Each case suggested not an individual exception but a program, a systematic approach to identifying, extracting, and protecting German intelligence personnel deemed valuable enough to employ. She filed Freedom of Information requests for the other case files. The responses stated that materials related to Cold War intelligence operations involving former enemy personnel remained classified under national security exemptions established in the 1950s and never rescinded, protected by institutional decisions that outlived everyone who made them, classified 80 years after the events they documented, decades after everyone involved must have died, protected not by operational necessity but by institutional reluctance to acknowledge what had been done in the name of intelligence advantage, what bargains had been struck, what crimes have been forgiven in exchange for expertise. In early 2025, Brenner received an anonymous email through an encrypted service that left no digital trail. No name, no traceable address, no identifying information. The message was brief. You found the file removal. Now ask who gave the order. Ask why his personnel file was pulled before the Soviets arrived, but after the decision to protect him was made. Ask who else's files were handled the same way. The removal operation was systematic. Nightingale wasn't the first or the only one. Look at the archive seizure records from April-May 1945. Look at what else went missing. The pattern is there if you know where to look. Brenner began investigating. In the documentation of the Allied seizure of SD archives in April-May 1945, she found references to materials being set aside for specialized review before the general cataloging process began. Reference numbers were listed. Files were noted as transferred to higher authority for security evaluation without specification of which authority or why such evaluation was necessary. Cross-referencing those reference numbers with the code names she'd found, Nightingale, Sparrow, Falcon, Eagle, Raven, suggested a pattern, not random file loss, not bureaucratic confusion, a systematic identification and removal of specific personnel files, coordinated with the protection and recruitment of the officers those files documented, a program designed to erase evidence of existence before employing the individuals whose existence had been erased. Every inquiry about these reference numbers, every request for information about the files that had been set aside, received the same response. Materials classified. No access authorized. No review date scheduled. 80 years after his personnel file was removed from SS archives in the final days of the Third Reich, Werner Brandt's story is partially known. He was an SS intelligence officer who made contact with Allied services in early 1945. His file was deliberately erased from captured archives. He was protected from prosecution. He worked for American intelligence for over 2 decades. He vanished into a protected identity that has never been revealed, living under a name we don't know, dying on a date that remains classified. But the full truth remains locked behind classification barriers maintained by institutions that decided his knowledge was worth more than accountability for his actions, that protecting him served interests that transcended justice. The files exist. They sit in archives marked with classifications that have never expired, protected by decisions made 80 years ago that have never been revisited, that may never be revisited because doing so would require acknowledging what those decisions meant. Because Werner Brandt's story isn't just about one man's betrayal and protection. It's about a system that made thousands of individual calculations about which former enemies were useful enough to employ, which crimes were forgivable enough to ignore, which truths were inconvenient enough to seal away permanently, and whether we'll ever know the full scope of those calculations, or only the fragments that serve institutional interests to reveal. The streets of Berlin are rebuilt now, the ruins of 1945 replaced by modern buildings and memorials to the victims of the regime that Brandt served. The Reich main security office on Prinz Albrechtstrasse is gone, demolished, replaced by a documentation center about Nazi crimes and the victims they created. But somewhere in the filing system, a personnel file still exists, or its absence is still noted in records that document what was removed. A gap in the archive where Werner Brandt should be but isn't, a deliberate erasure that someone decided was necessary and that someone else decided to maintain for 80 years. History records the trials, the prosecutions, the accounting for crimes. But the decisions to exempt certain individuals, to classify certain truths, to maintain certain silences across generations, those remain hidden behind barriers that may never fall. Werner Brandt was erased from World War II files. 80 years later, part of the truth came out, but only part. And maybe that's the only truth we were ever meant to have. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.